About 60 of them were under 17, but they've been taken to the police headquarters for their own safety. No charges have been made, but various substances found at the club are to be examined.
Oh, bless him. I have no idea what the substances were, but I remember that suit. Still, as they say, the trouble with the 60s is if you remember them, you weren't really there. But tonight we're going to meet some of the names who really were there, and we'll tell it as it was in swinging Britain, from music to sport, film, fashion and politics, and we'll be pulling back the covers on the so-called sexual revolution. But let us take a look behind those news headlines from the 1960s. Who on earth can forget that man landed on the moon? But what we didn't know at the time was that when Neil Armstrong took that historic Apollo 11 photograph, Buzz Aldrin was, in fact, relieving himself. So what you're looking at there is actually the first lunar leak. 1967 was the year of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album, but do you remember who knocked them off the #1 slot? It was, of course, Val Doonican Rocks, but gently. And if you can recall the great train robbery, then you'll be aware that the Postmaster General claimed it was all due to a precise knowledge of the train timetable. So, to foil any future attempts, British Airways decided to run the trains on a schedule that nobody could work out. So here we are today, and who better to lead our march back in time than one of the most influential figures of that decade?
Good evening and hello, pop pickers. I'm grateful to be asked here tonight as your Prime Minister on this very special occasion as we celebrate the remarkable decade that we are living in at the moment. And tonight, you know, I'd like to speak to you very frankly, very straightforwardly, with complete candor and sincerity. Still, you can't break the habits of a lifetime, so let me just say this. I remember something my old friend Jack Kennedy said to me recently when I was in Washington. Well, he said two things, actually. The first was that if he didn't have that girl in the green dress inside the next half hour, his trousers would explode. The second thing was, he said, Harold, he always liked British Prime Ministers to be called Harold because he was sure of remembering their names. Harold, the 60s will be remembered as the decade when the world changed forever. And that's true. You know, it's particularly true of our own country. The 60s marks the end of the old Britain and the birth of the new. And we in government are playing our part by offering a dynamic new leadership, sweeping away the worn-out traditions of class and privilege, represented by a Tory party plagued by sleazy sex scandals, vassal and perfumer, and by a nauseating social snobbery. I was talking about all this only yesterday with my old friend, Her Majesty the Queen. What a wonderful woman she is, so regal and gracious, such a flawless complexion. We get on terribly well together. She always looks forward to our Tuesday night audiences when I brief her on government policy. She says it's the only night of the week when she can relax and have a good laugh. And I pointed out to her that no Labour cabinet ministers ever got involved in sex scandals. And she said, when I look at you, Prime Minister, I'm not in the least bit surprised. A moving tribute from a noble lady. And you know, she gives her own leadership. She certainly promised me that at least in the matter of sex scandals, her own family would be leading the way in the future. I sometimes wonder, you know, what future historians will consider my own greatest achievement. After all, there's so much to choose from. I took Britain into Europe, but it was closed, so I took it out again. I united the Labour Party. I think it was for a Wednesday afternoon, but I'll have to check on that. But above all, I laid the foundation, despite some terrible setbacks, for the future greatness of this country. And nothing illustrates that better than two events which took place under my stewardship. On the one hand, we were forced to devalue the pound. On the other, we won the World Cup. And I can now confidently predict that in the future, as a result of my efforts, one of those two things will happen again, and the other certainly won't. And perhaps my greatest contribution has been to earn for our great movement, the Labour movement, the trust and confidence of the British people, to such an extent that no future Labour leader will ever have to look back and talk, as I do, about 13 years of Conservative rule. The British are daft, but they can't be that daft. Good night, and thank you. There will be 45 guineas, please.
Thank you very much for that, John. Now, Lady Castle, or Barbara Castle, as you were known then, of course, the 60s was the first time that politicians became targets of television satire, like That Was the Week That Was. What was the reaction at the time in the cabinet?
Well, we loved That Was the Week That Was because, of course, it was before our time. It was an attack on the last days of the Harold Macmillan and Alec Douglas Hume governments. One thing, though, I must say, was that no politician likes being laughed at savagely. I think Harold loved John's impersonations of him because they weren't malicious. They were affectionate and astonishingly accurate in many details. But other attacks Harold did dislike. And I remember he used to get very worked up in cabinet about what he considered were the biases in the media, particularly television. And he was always saying, oh, the BBC's against us, or ITV's against us, or whatever. And we used to say, oh, come off it, Harold. On the whole, they get it fairly well balanced.
John, did Harold Wilson ever tell you personally what he thought about your sketches?
There was one time in the BBC when Hugh Green was then the Director General, had a letter from Wilson himself saying that he objected, that there was an objection to something which I said, I can't remember what it was, and that if he hadn't been Prime Minister, he would sue. And Hugh Green apparently wrote back, or told me he wrote back, and said that, dear Prime Minister, please don't feel just because you're Prime Minister you don't have to sue. Please go ahead and sue if you want to. But he didn't.
Well, of course, Private Eye started in the early 60s. Politicians gave them plenty of material to work with. One of the best-selling editions then about the Profumo scandal was handed to them on a plate. Now, Richard Ingrams, of course, was editor. Was everything fair game from the very start, Richard?
Well, I think the Tories got it, as Barbara Castle was saying, the Tories got it in the neck from the beginning of the satire boom, because they were the government and they had been in power for 13 years. And particularly Harold Macmillan. I think Peter Cook began the tradition of mocking Harold Macmillan, which that was the week carried on. I don't think the Labour Party started to be really savagely attacked in Private Eye until about 1967 when the devaluation of the pound took place. And Wilson had a very easy ride to begin with, because he was such a successful, promoted himself so successfully as this technocrat who was going to sweep away all the Tory cobwebs and the fuddy-duddies and the Macmillans and the Humes. And a lot of us, including myself, I think, were to some extent taken in by that. Later on, he began to emerge as a much more promising comic figure than ever Macmillan had been. He was the best, from Private Eye's point of view, he was much the best material that any Prime Minister in this country in that period has ever been, I think, from a purely jokey point of view.
Now, Lance Percival, now you, of course, you were one of the regulars on That Was the Week That Was. Do you think it's had a lasting effect?
Not in the sense of that they were talking earlier about governments, etc., because Alec Douglas Hume complained at one time that That Was the Week That Was partly responsible for him losing the election. But we came off the air at the end of December, and the election wasn't until April. Now, for instance, in modern day times, Spitting Image had a go at John Major right up to the 1992 election. But John Major still won, which doesn't say much for Spitting Image, but you see what I mean. On the other hand, you find that lines of those days about political figures last just as well as today. For instance, there's a line going around which we used 30 years ago, that now that Neil Kinnock has not got his European job, he's writing a Welsh version of the Kama Sutra instead, having been in every position except number 10. We used a very similar line to that with Hugh Gaitskell many years before, but not exactly the same line, the same idea. Yep. So a good story works 30 years later just as well.
Certainly does. Now, Screaming Lord Such is here. My lord, you actually stood against Harold Wilson in 64 and 66.
Yes,
why did you think that the country needed you to do that?
Well, because at the time you couldn't vote until you was 21, which I thought was ridiculous. I met a lot of young people, a lot of rock and rollers that couldn't vote. They had loads of kids. They could fight for their country. So I stood for votes at 18, and also I stood, as you know, the BBC had the monopoly, so I stood for commercial radio and actually run my own radio station, Radio Such. And also for the 3 R's, reading, writing, and rock and roll!
Funny you should mention that, because in the 1960s, of course, the establishment through the BBC was keen not to lose control over the selection of music that we could listen to. Upstart broadcasters had to leave our shores to get a voice.
Piracy. That's what's happening here, with the connivance of almost every teenager in southeast England at any rate. We're bound for Radio Caroline, the pirate ship that for over a year has given pop music to something like 20 million listeners, as their advertising sales staff claim. There's just a 10-kilowatt transmitter pumping the music out, but millions of kids have learned to say, "I love Caroline" on 199, and they lap it up from 6 in the morning until 8 o'clock at night. The disc jockeys have got themselves fan clubs out of the job that the Postmaster General is trying to stop.
Tony Blackburn, you were that baby-faced pirate, corrupting the nation's youth.
Well, not at all, actually. We were trying to give the youngsters what they wanted to hear. And we were all youngsters in those days, and as Scribbling Lord Such said, the BBC had the monopoly, and that had to be broken. I mean, we didn't really look upon ourselves as pirates. I mean, all we were doing, we were going out of the country, officially going to Holland, but we stopped off on the way. And we provided all the music, and I think if it hadn't been for the pirate radio ships, Radio Caroline and Radio London, I still think we'd probably have that BBC monopoly.
Now, Johnny Walker, you, of course, stayed on, and you actually did break the law. Why did you feel that you had to really rock the boat?
Well, I didn't like the hypocrisy of Harold Wilson. I mean, he used to get photographs taken with the Beatles and like to associate the Labour government as being pro-young people. And then they turn around and introduce a law that's going to put all the pirates out. And also, I didn't think the BBC would be very good at it. And I mean, Radio 1 in the beginning would feature Jimmy Young with the Northern Dance Orchestra singing Unchained Melody, which was my idea of rock and roll radio. So if Caroline wanted to stay on after August the 14th, when the law came in, I wanted to be a part of it.
Fair enough. Well, the establishment was being attacked on all sides. On the 13th of November, 1965, the nation was shocked as the F word was used for the first time on television in the latest satire show, BBC 3. Now, Robert Robinson was in the chair. Robert, were you horrified?
Well, the audience was. I mean, in those, it's very difficult to remember. What a deep taboo that word had. You never heard it in public except by accident. Now, of course, it's obligatory. If you don't use it, you get arrested by the political incorrectness police. But when Tynan did it, I can remember the terrible intake of breath. As though everyone had had their darkest secret suddenly revealed. But the nicest thing was, a week later, I was looking in a shop in the King's Road, and I saw a reflection behind me, and it looked like a huge bear. And I turned round, and it was a very large old lady with a red face and a ginger fur coat, and she said, "Hello, Mr. Robinson. I'm Lady Normanbrook, the wife of the chairman of the BBC." And she spoke in a rather old-fashioned way, and she said, "Oh, Norman's not been at all well, you know, but they sent him a new wireless round, and it's got a much bigger picture, and it's cheered him up enormously." And then she said, "You know that word Mr. Tynan used?" And I said, "Well, I'm afraid I do." She said, "Well, it forms no part of my vocabulary." And I said, "Well, I should jolly well think not." But she said, "Ever since Mr. Tynan said it, I've been using it all the time."
I wonder what she used before. Now, George Melly, as a fellow critic of Tynan's, your response to all that was what?
Oh, it was like a marvellous glass of champagne. I was sitting watching the television, as I was a television critic at the time, so I would have been doing rather late at night, in Gloucester Crescent, with Dr. Jonathan Miller. Indeed, it was an area much satirized in Private Eye at that time. I was always represented as a figure who simply belched from time to time, but I did rather more. And suddenly, it seemed to me in a perfectly acceptable way, Tynan got fed up with this constant moving around the word and said, "Surely we're grown-up people and we can actually say it." And It was like a little shock of electricity. We sent him a telegram congratulating him, actually. I don't know if I'd do that now.
What did you say in the telegram?
Oh, congratulations. Oh, something to that. Why would one say more? One wouldn't add an adjective necessarily, would one? Because it seemed to be like an act of courage, and it released the word. I think now it appears comparatively trivial that he used it. But at the time, it seemed good to be able to use a word to describe something without having to go miles round the houses in order to indicate that two people were pleasuring each other, you see. Yes.
Thank you. Johnny Spade's character, Alf Garnett, of course, I mean, he created something of a sensation himself by using pretty ripe language. Did you sympathize as well with Kenneth Tynan?
Well, he told me, because we were fellow stutterers, I thought mine's a bit better than it used to be, and as a stutterer you know that if you're going the sibilants are very difficult, and if you catch one coming you have to say it before your stutter notices it. Otherwise you're in real trouble. And apparently he said that he was asked would he like to see I'm starting now would he like to see sex on the stage, and as he went to say sex, as a stutterer your mind freezes and you know there's no way that word's going to come out. And the F word is a crutch for stutterers. It really is. And that is why I believe it's so popular. That is why it's so popular.
Thank you. Nearly 30 years later, that word, as you've heard, is still a hot potato whenever it escapes onto the air. And for many people, it's never acceptable language at any time.
Large young people, we recognise that the period between 6 and 9:15 is a period for family viewing. Well, I think we're being palmed off. Because last Thursday evening we sat as a family and we saw a programme that started at 6:35. And it was the dirtiest programme that I have seen for a very long time.
Mary Whitehouse, what were you referring to?
I haven't the faintest idea.
That comes as something of a disappointment, I must say.
Oh, well, there were so many at that time anyway.
Did you feel that Kenneth Tynan was opening the floodgates?
I don't know, not at that particular time. I mean, if you talk about opening the floodgates, you've got to refer to some of the films and plays that we've had recently on television. It's such an ugly word.
Well, there is another four-letter word that may well have shocked you at the time, and that would have been H-A-I-R. Now, here's a squeaky clean bit from that pioneering rock musical, Hair.
They see me in my toga made of blonde, brilliant scene, biblical hair. My hair like Jesus wore it, hallelujah, I adore it, hallelujah, Mary loved her son. Why don't my mother love me? Blow it, show it, love the traffic going my blow it, show it, love the traffic going my.
But now the camera zooming in and out was fairly disgusting, but it was Hair that brought four-letter words and nudity to the West End stage for the first time. Poor Nicholas, how far did you go?
Well, I always try to go all the way, Michael, but in that show I didn't, because the thing you're referring to is the infamous nude scene at the end of Act 1, and that was the moment where all of the cast stood up and took their clothes off. But I was the only one who didn't have to, because I was the guy in the middle singing the song, but for some reason no one remembers me or the song.
But Oliver Tobias, you did get them off, didn't you? I wonder what was the response of the audience, I mean, to the show, or all of it.
Well, first of all, the audience establishment was beautiful. Glitz, brilliancy, gleamed, dinner jackets. And after that, they turned into animals. They rushed the stage, took their clothes off and danced with us, which later became an established thing to drag the audience on stage. But they literally rushed the stage, and it was quite an incredible experience. To see the break from we were dressed in rags with long hair and the kind of richness and the glitz turning over and liberating. It was extraordinary, quite an extraordinary moment.
Well, yes, of course, Marsha Hunt, it was at the end of the 60s, this show, wasn't it? So, I mean, was it in fact really such a sort of a breaking down of barriers?
Well, it was 1968, and in fact, I think experimental theater had done a great deal more than it's given credit for. And what changed with Hair was that these plays where people were taking their clothes off and being explicit in their speech and whatnot, was taken to the commercial stage and made a lot of money and attracted audiences who were not interested in experimental theater. I don't know whether it broke as much ground as people claimed. I think what was important was it opened the day after the Lord Chamberlain lost his powers to censor what went on in the West End.
Yes, that's significant, obviously. Well,
I didn't take my clothes off very much, by the way. I have to say that we weren't paid to do that. So if you weren't feeling inclined on the night, you could just lie there and check out who had what.
So no backstage romances, obviously. Well, Hair and Flower Power were imported influences from across the Atlantic. Over there, they might have been turning on, tuning in, and dropping out. Here, we took things at a slower pace and switched on to the gentle, folksy sounds of our own love children. Ladies and gentlemen, Donovan.
Uncertainty, I want to be in the warm home of your loving mind. Want to feel you all around me and to take your hand along the sand. But I may as well try and catch the wind. Sundown, here's the sky. I wanna hide a while behind your smile, and everywhere I'd look, your eyes would find. For me to love you now would be the sweetest thing. 'Twould make me sing. But I may as well try and catch the wind. When rain hides on the leaves with tears, I want you near, for to kill my fears. But I may as well try and catch. But I may as well try and catch the wind.
Thank you very much. Still to come, Swinging with Sandy Shaw, Sex with Rita Fashingham, and a bit of a knockabout with George Best.